The desert stretched endlessly before Cal McKenna as he rode his sorrel gelding through the shimmering heat of the Arizona Territory. It was the summer of 1876, and the land was as unforgiving as the men who tried to tame it. Cal's weathered face, bronzed by countless days under the merciless sun, bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much violence and carried too many regrets. His clothes were dusty and worn, patched in places where thorns and bullets had found their mark, and his boots showed the scars of 1,000 miles of hard riding. The weight of his gun belt felt familiar around his hips, though the holster that had once carried his father's peacemaker now held a newer Colt, scarred and reliable. More troubling was the weight in his cartridge belt, or rather, the lack of it. After 3 days of hard riding and a running fight with Apache raiders who'd been tracking him since he'd left the settlement of Bitter Creek, Cal was down to his last bullet. One brass cartridge sat lonely in the leather loops of his belt, while the chambers of his revolver held nothing but empty brass casings. He'd been too pressed to reload. Cal had been riding alone for the better part of 5 years now, ever since the war ended, and he'd found there was no place for him in the world that was trying to rebuild itself. Some men had gone home to families and farms, but Cal's family lay buried in the churchyard back in Missouri, victims of raiders who'd struck while he was off fighting for the Union. The farm had been burned, the stock driven off, and everything he'd known had turned to ash and bitter memory. So he'd pointed his horse west and never looked back, making his living as a scout, a guard for wagon trains, sometimes a deputy sheriff when towns needed a man who wasn't afraid to face down trouble. The town of Perdition's Gate lay somewhere ahead, though Cal couldn't be sure how far. The heat played tricks with distance in this country, making rocks look like buildings and mirages dance like lakes across the desert floor. His horse, a good animal named Dusty who'd carried him through more scrapes than either of them cared to count, was showing signs of the hard travel. The gelding's head hung lower than usual, and foam flecked his neck where the bridle rubbed. They both needed water, rest, and supplies, but Cal knew they'd have to make do with whatever Perdition's Gate could offer. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Cal of muzzle flashes in the gathering dusk, he crested a low ridge and saw smoke rising from a small valley below. Not the clean white smoke of a cook fire, but the thick black smoke that spoke of trouble. Spurring Dusty forward, Cal descended into the valley, his hand instinctively checking the weight of his Colt, even though he knew what little good it would do him with only one bullet between him and whatever waited below. The smoke was coming from an overturned stagecoach, its wooden body splintered and burning where it had crashed into a stand of mesquite. The harness had been cut away, and the team was nowhere to be seen, likely driven off by whoever had caused this disaster. Bodies lay scattered around the wreckage, and Cal could see at least 3 men who'd died fighting, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. But it was the sound that caught his attention, a low moaning that spoke of someone still alive in that valley of death. Dismounting carefully, Cal approached the wreckage with his gun drawn, that single bullet chambered and ready. The moaning was coming from behind the overturned coach, where a man lay pinned beneath the heavy wooden frame. He was young, maybe 25, with the soft hands and clean clothes of someone who'd lived an easier life than most frontier folk. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, and his left leg was trapped beneath the coach's weight, twisted at an angle that spoke of broken bones. "Help me," the man whispered when he saw Cal approaching. "Please, I can't feel my leg." Cal holstered his weapon and knelt beside the trapped man, quickly assessing the situation. The coach was heavy, probably too heavy for one man to lift, but the way it had fallen left a small gap that might be enough if the timber could be shifted just right. "What happened here?" Cal asked as he began looking for something to use as a lever. "Bandits," the man gasped, his face pale with pain and shock. "They knew about the payroll, knew exactly when we'd be coming through. Killed the driver and guard first, then started shooting. I played dead until they rode off." He tried to move and cried out in pain. "They took everything, left us all for dead." Cal found a sturdy piece of wood that had broken off from the coach and positioned it as a lever against a nearby rock. "What's your name, son?" "Thomas Whitmore," the man replied. "I work for the Territorial Bank in Phoenix. This was supposed to be a routine transfer." He looked up at Cal with desperate eyes. "You're not one of them, are you? Come back to finish the job." "No, son, I'm not," Cal said, putting his weight behind the lever. "Name's Cal McKenna, and I'm going to get you out of there." The heavy timber groaned as Cal strained against it, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. Slowly, inch by precious inch, the weight began to lift. "Now!" Cal shouted. "Pull your leg out!" Thomas screamed as he dragged his mangled leg from beneath the coach, but he was free. Cal let the timber settle back into place and immediately began examining the young man's injuries. The leg was badly broken, probably in 2 places, and would need immediate attention if Thomas was going to keep it. But that wasn't the most pressing concern. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley, and Cal could see dust rising from the ridge he'd just descended. Someone was coming, and given the recent massacre, Cal didn't figure them for the Good Samaritan type. He quickly counted the dust trails and felt his blood run cold. At least 6 riders, maybe more, and they were coming fast. "Those bandits you mentioned," Cal said, helping Thomas sit up against the overturned coach. "What did they look like?" "The leader had a scar running down the left side of his face," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "Rode a big black stallion and wore silver conchos on his hatband. Called himself Scarface Jack. Said his gang controlled this whole territory." Cal knew the name. Jack Morrison, better known as Scarface Jack, was wanted in 3 territories for robbery, murder, and worse. His gang had been terrorizing this part of Arizona for months, hitting stagecoaches, robbing banks, and killing anyone who got in their way. If they were coming back, it probably meant they'd forgotten something or wanted to make sure there were no witnesses left alive. The riders crested the ridge, and Cal could see them clearly now. 7 men all armed and looking like they meant business. The leader rode a magnificent black horse and wore a hat with silver conchos that caught the last rays of sunlight. Even at this distance, Cal could make out the jagged scar that ran from the man's left temple to his jaw, the calling card that had earned him his reputation and his name. "Can you use a gun?" Cal asked Thomas, though he could see the young man's hands were shaking too badly to be of much use in a fight. "I've never shot a man in my life," Thomas admitted. "I don't even carry a weapon." Cal checked his Colt one more time, feeling the weight of that single bullet in the chamber. 7 armed men against 1 bullet and a wounded civilian. The odds couldn't have been worse if he'd planned it that way. But there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide in this valley, and leaving Thomas would be the same as putting a bullet in him himself. "Listen to me," Cal said, his voice calm despite the approaching danger. "When the shooting starts, you roll underneath what's left of that coach and stay there. Don't come out no matter what you hear." The riders had reached the bottom of the valley now, their horses' hooves kicking up dust as they approached. Scarface Jack raised his hand, and the group slowed to a walk, spreading out in a line that would give them multiple angles of fire. Cal stepped away from Thomas and into the open, his hand resting easy on his gun butt. "Well, well," Scarface Jack called out as his horse pranced nervously beneath him. "Looks like we got ourselves a survivor after all, and a friend who's come to help." His voice carried the lazy drawl of a man who'd grown comfortable with violence and confident in his own cruelty. "Afternoon," Cal replied, his tone conversational, despite the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. "Nice day for a ride." Jack laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Indeed it is, stranger, indeed it is. You know, we worked real hard to make sure there wouldn't be any witnesses to our little business transaction here. Seems we might have missed one." "Seems like you might have," Cal agreed. "Course accidents happen. Man could ride away, forget what he saw, mind his own business." "Oh, I'm sure he could," Jack said, his scarred face splitting in a grin that held no warmth. "But see, that wouldn't be good for our reputation. Can't have folks thinking old Scarface Jack's getting soft in his old age." He leaned forward in his saddle, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step away from that bank man there, nice and easy, and then you're going to join him in whatever comes next. Makes it simpler for everyone." Cal took a step forward instead of back, his boots crunching on the broken glass and scattered papers that littered the ground around the destroyed stagecoach. "I got a different idea," he said quietly. "How about you boys just ride on out of here, and we'll call it even?" The other gang members laughed at that, a chorus of harsh sounds that spoke of men who'd forgotten what mercy looked like. But Jack held up a hand, and the laughter stopped. "You got sand, mister. I'll give you that. But sand don't stop bullets, and we got a lot more bullets than you do." "Maybe," Cal said, "but I only need one." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Cal could see understanding dawn in Jack's eyes. This wasn't going to be the easy execution the outlaw leader had planned. The stranger standing before him wasn't begging for his life or trying to bargain his way out of trouble. He was preparing to fight, and that changed everything. "Boys," Jack said softly, never taking his eyes off Cal, "this here fellow thinks he's some kind of gunfighter. Maybe we should find out if he's right." The 7 riders began to spread out wider, their horses dancing as they sensed the tension building between their riders. Cal remained motionless in the center of the valley, his hand still resting casually on his gun butt, but every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He was acutely aware of Thomas behind him, breathing hard with pain and fear, and of the single brass cartridge that represented the only chance either of them had of seeing another sunrise. "Last chance, stranger," Jack called out. "You can die easy, or you can die hard. Makes no difference to us." Cal's response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the mounted gunman. "I reckon that's up to you boys," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "But if you want this bank man, you're going to have to go through me to get him." Scarface Jack's hand moved toward his gun, and Cal knew the moment for talking was over. In the space of a heartbeat, everything would change, and that single bullet would determine whether justice or cruelty ruled this small corner of the Arizona desert. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled on the evening thermals, waiting to see what carrion the coming violence might provide. The draw happened faster than thought. Muscle memory and desperation combining in a motion Cal had practiced 10,000 times. His Colt cleared leather as Jack's gun came up, and for an instant that stretched like eternity. The 2 men faced each other across 20 yards of desert floor, each with death in his hand. Cal's single bullet spoke first, the report echoing off the valley walls like thunder, and Scarface Jack pitched backward from his saddle with a hole through his heart. But 6 other guns were already clearing their holsters, and Cal knew his moment of triumph would last exactly as long as it took those men to pull their triggers. He dove sideways, rolling behind the overturned stagecoach as bullets whined through the air where he'd been standing. Wood splintered, and metal rang as the gang poured lead into their cover, shouting curses and threats as they realized their leader was dead. "How you killed Jack?" one of them screamed, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. "You killed Scarface Jack with 1 shot?" Cal pressed his back against the coach's wooden side, his empty gun useless in his hand. Thomas lay beside him, eyes wide with terror, clutching his broken leg and trying to make himself as small as possible. The shooting had stopped for a moment, but Cal could hear the gang members talking among themselves, planning their next move. "Burn them out," one voice suggested. "Set fire to that coach and smoke them like rabbits." "No," came another voice, older and more controlled. "That was some shooting, boys. 1 bullet, 1 kill, at 20 yards with 6 guns pointed at him. Any man who can shoot like that deserves a chance to surrender proper." "Mister," the older voice called out, "you hear me in there? Name's Walt Morrison, and I was Jack's lieutenant. You just killed my boss with the finest piece of shooting I ever seen. Now I got 5 men with me, and we got you outnumbered and outgunned. But you earned yourself a chance to walk away from this. Come out with your hands up, and we'll let you ride out of here." Cal checked his cartridge belt one more time, hoping against hope that he'd missed a bullet somewhere, but the leather loops were empty. He looked at Thomas, who was staring at him with something approaching awe despite his pain and fear. "You really killed their leader with 1 shot," Thomas whispered. "Lucky shot," Cal replied quietly. "And luck ain't something a man can count on twice in 1 day." "Mister," Walt Morrison called again, "I'm a patient man, but my boys ain't. You got about 10 seconds to make up your mind before they decide to ventilate that coach with you in it." Cal closed his eyes and thought about his options. He could surrender and trust that Morrison was a man of his word, but trusting the word of an outlaw was like trusting a rattlesnake not to bite. He could make a run for it, but that would leave Thomas to die, and Cal couldn't live with another death on his conscience. Or he could make his last stand here and take as many of them with him as possible, though without bullets that wasn't much of a plan. "What's it going to be?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible above the sound of restless horses and muttered conversations from the gang. Before Cal could answer, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley, coming from the ridge they'd all descended earlier. Morrison and his men heard it too, their voices rising in alarm as they tried to figure out what was happening. The shooting was getting closer, and Cal could see dust rising from multiple sources as if a large group of riders was approaching fast. "What in hell?" Morrison shouted. "Billy, get up on that ridge and see what's coming." "Can't see nothing, Walt," came the reply. "Too much dust." The gunfire was definitely getting closer now, and Cal could hear the thunder of hoofbeats echoing off the valley walls. Someone was coming, and they were coming hard. The question was whether they were friends or enemies, though in this part of the territory, strangers usually fell into the latter category. "Could be a posse," one of Morrison's men suggested nervously. "Maybe someone heard the shooting." "Ain't no law in 50 miles of here," Morrison replied, but Cal could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "But whoever it is, they're armed, and they're headed this way." The first riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light like figures from a fever dream. But instead of the small group Morrison expected, what crested that hill was an army. Dozens of horsemen, all armed, all riding with the purposeful intent of men who meant business, and at their head, barely visible in the gathering dusk, rode a figure that made Cal's heart skip a beat. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Thomas breathed, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "There must be 100 of them." Morrison's gang was already backing their horses away from the overturned coach, suddenly less interested in finishing their business with Cal and more concerned with the small army bearing down on them. But the new arrivals had them surrounded before they could retreat more than a few yards, horses and riders flowing around the valley like water around stones. "Walt Morrison," a voice called out, carrying clearly across the desert air. "This is Marshal Ben Hawkins. You and your boys are surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Cal knew that voice, had ridden with Ben Hawkins during the war and trusted him more than any man alive. But that didn't explain how a federal marshal had appeared in this god-forsaken valley with what looked like half the territory's population riding behind him. "We got you outnumbered 5-1, Marshal," Morrison called back, though his voice lacked conviction. "You best think twice before you start something you can't finish." "I count different, Morrison," came Hawkins' reply. "I see 6 of you and about 97 of us. Those odds don't favor you much." As if to emphasize the point, the riders began closing their circle, and Cal could see rifle barrels glinting in the fading light. These weren't lawmen or soldiers, but civilians, ranchers and cowboys and townspeople, all armed and all looking like they meant business. What in the name of Sam Hill was going on here? "Cal McKenna," Hawkins called out. "You in there? Sound off if you can hear me." Cal stood up behind the overturned coach, his empty gun still in his hand. "I'm here, Ben. Got a wounded civilian with me." "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The man who killed Jack knows the marshal. Ain't that something?" What happened next defied everything Cal thought he knew about how the world worked. Ben Hawkins rode forward, alone and unarmed, straight toward Morrison and his gang. But instead of drawing weapons, Morrison's men began lowering theirs, looking around at the overwhelming force surrounding them with expressions of resignation and defeat. "Boys," Morrison said finally, "I think our fighting days just came to an end." One by one, Morrison's gang threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The mysterious army of civilians closed in, disarming the outlaws and binding their hands with the efficiency of men who'd done this before. And through it all, Cal stood behind that overturned stagecoach, trying to understand what he was seeing. Ben Hawkins dismounted and walked over to where Cal stood, his weathered face split by a grin that seemed to light up the gathering darkness. "Cal McKenna," he said, extending his hand. "Been looking for you for 3 days now." "Ben," Cal replied, shaking his old friend's hand. "Good to see you, but I got to ask, what in the hell is going on here? Where did all these men come from?" Hawkins chuckled and gestured toward the crowd of armed civilians who were securing Morrison's gang. "Word travels fast in this territory, Cal, especially word about a man who'd use his last bullet to save a stranger's life." Cal stared at his friend in confusion. "What are you talking about? This just happened 5 minutes ago." "Not this," Hawkins said, his expression growing serious. "What happened 3 days ago in Bitter Creek, when you used your last bullet to save that preacher's daughter from the Apache war party that had her cornered. When you faced down 6 warriors with nothing but an empty gun and more courage than any man has a right to carry." The memory came flooding back, and Cal felt his face flush with embarrassment. 3 days ago, riding hard from an Apache raid, he'd come across a young woman trapped in a box canyon, her horse shot from under her and war-painted warriors closing in for the kill. Cal had used his last bullet to drop the lead warrior, then bluffed the others into retreat by making them think he had more ammunition than he actually carried. The girl had made it safely back to town, but Cal had ridden on without talking to anyone about what had happened. "Sarah Whitmore told everyone in Bitter Creek what you did," Hawkins continued, "about how you risked your life to save hers, even though you didn't know her from Eve, about how you could have ridden on and minded your own business, but you stopped to help because it was the right thing to do." "Whitmore?" Cal looked down at Thomas, who was listening to every word despite his pain. "Any relation?" "My sister," Thomas said weakly. "Sarah Whitmore. She's been telling everyone who'll listen about the cowboy who saved her life. Said he was the finest man she'd ever met, and that anyone who'd stand with him would be standing with righteousness itself." Hawkins nodded. "When word spread about what happened to this stagecoach and that Cal McKenna was riding this way, well, folks started saddling up. Ranchers, cowboys, townspeople, even the preacher from Bitter Creek. Turns out there's a lot of good people in this territory who believe in standing up for what's right." Cal looked around at the faces surrounding him, men he'd never met who'd ridden hard to reach this valley, who'd risked their lives to stand with a stranger because of something he'd done 3 days ago. There were weathered ranchers and young cowboys, a banker from Phoenix and a blacksmith from Tucson, even a few women who'd ridden out with their menfolk because they believed in the cause. "But how did you know I'd be here?" Cal asked. "We didn't," admitted a voice from the crowd. Cal turned to see an older man with a badge pinned to his vest, probably a sheriff from one of the nearby towns. "We were tracking Morrison's gang, trying to catch up before they killed again. When we heard shooting in this valley, we figured we'd find their latest victims. Never expected to find you making a stand with 1 bullet against 7 men." "Wasn't much of a choice," Cal said quietly. "Couldn't leave the bank man to die." "That's exactly what Sarah said you'd say," Hawkins replied with another grin. "Said you were too modest for your own good, but too honorable to walk away from trouble." As the evening stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the impromptu army of civilians began making camp in the valley. Cook fires were lit, bedrolls were spread, and the wounded Thomas was tended to by a doctor who'd ridden out from Perdition's Gate. Cal found himself surrounded by men who wanted to shake his hand, to hear about what had happened in Bitter Creek, to talk about the fine shot that had dropped Scarface Jack. "Thing is," Ben Hawkins said as they sat around one of the cook fires, sharing coffee and conversation, "this isn't just about what you did for Sarah, or even what you did here tonight. Word's been spreading about Morrison's gang, about how they've been terrorizing this whole territory. Folks are tired of being afraid, tired of waiting for someone else to do something about it. And they think I'm that someone?" Cal asked, uncomfortable with the attention. "They think you're the kind of man who stands up when standing up needs to be done," replied the sheriff Cal had spoken with earlier. "Name's Tom Bradley, by the way, sheriff of Perdition's Gate. Been chasing Morrison for 6 months, never could get close enough to matter." Around the fire, other men began to speak up, telling their own stories about Morrison's gang, about friends and family who'd been killed or robbed, about the fear that had gripped the territory for too long. And slowly, Cal began to understand what was happening here. These men hadn't just come to rescue him, they'd come to follow him. "We want you to lead us," Hawkins said finally, giving voice to what everyone was thinking. "Help us clean up this territory once and for all. There's other gangs out there, other men like Morrison who think they can take what they want and kill anyone who gets in their way." Cal looked around the circle of faces, illuminated by firelight and filled with hope and determination. "I'm just one man," he said. "I ain't no general or lawman. Hell, an hour ago I was down to my last bullet." "But you used that bullet to save a life instead of save yourself," said another voice from the darkness. "That tells us everything we need to know about what kind of man you are." The conversation continued late into the night, but Cal already knew what his answer would be. He thought about Sarah Whitmore, trapped in that canyon with nowhere to run. He thought about Thomas, pinned beneath the overturned coach and facing certain death. He thought about all the other innocent people who were living in fear because men like Morrison believed that might made right. When the sun rose over the Arizona desert the next morning, it shone down on something that had never existed before in that part of the territory. An army of righteous men, led by a cowboy who'd learned that sometimes one bullet, fired for the right reason, could change everything. Cal McKenna, who'd ridden into that valley alone and nearly defenseless, found himself at the head of nearly 100 armed men who were ready to follow him into whatever battles lay ahead. As they rode out of the valley, leaving Morrison's gang trussed up for transport to the nearest jail, Cal carried a new gun belt, heavy with ammunition, gifted by men who believed in what he represented. But more than that, he carried the knowledge that sometimes when a man gives everything he has to help a stranger, the whole world conspires to give him back an army. The lonely cowboy who'd faced down 7 outlaws with 1 bullet had become something more, a leader, a symbol, and the focal point for every decent person in the territory who was tired of living in fear. The legend of Cal McKenna was just beginning, and it would be written in gunpowder and courage across the wild Arizona desert.